All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the absolute most infamous events in modern music history. Today, we're looking at the Altamont Speedway Free Festival, which happened on December 6, 1969. Now, in the popular imagination, this event is notoriously remembered as the darkest day in rock history, period. But to really grasp what went down, we need to strip away decades of rumors and look directly at the sources. We're going to break down the logistics, the decisions, and the tragic sequence of events step by step to find out what actually happened.
And that brings us to the big central question framing our explainer today. How did a free concert kill the 1960s? I mean, how did this utopian vision of peace, love, and music so rapidly degenerate into such jarring chaos and violence? It's a completely fascinating question. So to answer it, we're going to look really closely at the source material to see exactly how a massive gathering meant to celebrate a generation ended up symbolizing its demise.
Section 1. Planning Woodstock West.
History absolutely loves simple contrasts, doesn't it? The myth we've all been sold basically tells us that Woodstock was pure good, right? A magical utopia of peace and music. And Altamont was pure evil the day the music died. It's a classic example of how human memory just romanticizes history to fit a really neat narrative. But the reality reported in our sources is far more grounded in logistics. The truth is, both Woodstock and Altamont were logistical nightmares. Both involved hundreds of thousands of people, terrible weather, and awful conditions. The real difference? Woodstock had a little bit of luck, and Altamont tragically had absolutely none.
Just think about the sheer scale of the gamble they were taking here. 300,000. That is the estimated number of people who descended on the Altamont Speedway in Tracy, California on that single day, December 6, 1969. To put that into perspective for a second, imagine an entire city, roughly the size of Atlanta at the time, just showing up in a field with barely a day and a half of planning. It is a staggering recipe for overwhelm.
So what actually drew a crowd of that size? Well, it was a powerhouse lineup born out of a real clash of massive egos and financial motivations. You had Santana, Jefferson Airplane, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, and of course, the Rolling Stones. But take a look at the Grateful Dead at the bottom there, listed as organizers. The Dead were incredibly instrumental in setting up the infrastructure, and they were really hoping to piggyback off the Stones' immense fame for a future tour. The Rolling Stones, on the other hand, well, they were highly motivated to solidify their status as the top band in the world, and crucially, to reap profits from a documentary film they were bankrolling, a film that would eventually become Gimme Shelter.
Section 2. A recipe for disaster.
Okay, so we just talked about a crowd of 300,000 people. Now I want you to juxtapose that massive number with this one, $500. Our sources document that the organizers secured the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club to provide security for the event in exchange for $500 worth of beer. Just let that sink in for a second. Hiring a motorcycle gang, paying them in alcohol, and tasking them with managing a crowd of 1/3 people, it is a logistical decision of such monumental hubris that it almost defies belief. And if paying your security in beer wasn't bad enough, honestly, the venue itself was essentially a physical trap. The entire setup was totally rushed into place in just 36 hours. But perhaps the most fatal flaw of the whole shebang was the stage. Picture this. It was unusually low to the ground, and it was placed at the very bottom of a slope. This meant that the massive, swelling crowd of 300,000 people was constantly, gravitationally, pushing down directly onto this low, exposed stage. Imagine the intense claustrophobia of being at the very front, with hundreds of thousands of people pressing at your back, pushing you against a small, heavily intoxicated ring of Hells Angels who were trying to protect the stage. Section 3. Chaos and violence erupt.
The violence started almost immediately. Literally within seconds of stepping off his helicopter, Mick Jagger gets punched right in the face by a concertgoer. And as the day progressed, things only got worse. Denise Jukes, a pregnant musician from a local band, was hit in the head by an empty beer bottle thrown from the crowd and suffered a skull fracture that actually required emergency surgery. During Jefferson Airplane's set, lead singer Marty Balin was completely knocked unconscious during an altercation. The Grateful Dead saw this incredible violence unfolding, and they just entirely canceled their scheduled set. They wanted no part of it.
It was a complete tactical security nightmare. See, the Hells Angels had parked their motorcycles directly in front of the stage to act as a sort of physical bulwark. But as the massive crowd grew restless and pushed forward, and as the Angels consumed the very beer they were paid with, the whole situation just exploded. Intoxicated Hells Angels began hurling full beer cans and literally assaulting restless crowd members with sawed-off, weighted pull cues and motorcycle chains. It was a brutal, terrifying effort to drive the crush of people back from the stage and away from their bikes. Section 4. Tragedy. Meredith Hunter's death. To truly grasp the human cost of this chaos, we have to look at the tragic ripple effect of cause and effect. Meredith Curly Hunter Jr. was an 18-year-old young man from Berkeley, California, known to his friends as a really flashy dresser. Crucially, our texts note that his sister had warned him about the prevalent racism out in the outer reaches of Alameda County where the festival was being held. And because of this specific warning, Hunter made a fatal choice. He brought a .22 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver to the concert, strictly for his own protection. So it's early evening, the Rolling Stones are playing their song Under My Thumb, and the tension finally snaps. Hunter climbs on top of his speaker box, right next to the stage. A Hells Angel grabs him by the head and punches him. Hunter is then chased back into the crowd, where 4 angels descend upon him. Just imagine the sheer panic and adrenaline of being beaten by a motorcycle gang and swallowed up by a massive, chaotic crowd. Following this initial violent physical beating, witnesses reported that Hunter came back to the front of the stage and he was enraged, irrational, and obviously deeply upset about the violence that had just been inflicted upon him. What happens next is a chaotic sequence captured on film that literally lasts just 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, the tragedy culminates. A 6-foot opening suddenly appears in the dense crowd. Hunter enters the frame, and the silhouette of a long-barreled revolver is clearly seen drawn and raised in his hand. A Hells Angel named Alan Pissarro rushes in from the right, parrying Hunter's gun away with his left hand. And in the exact same motion, Pissarro uses his right hand to stab Hunter. The aftermath was grim. Meredith Hunter suffered 5 stab wounds to his upper back. Witnesses stated he was stomped on by several angels while on the ground. The gun was recovered by police, and the angels actually didn't report any discharged cartridges. The autopsy later confirmed that Hunter had methamphetamine in his bloodstream at the time of his death. It paints a complete and frankly dark picture of paranoia, chaos, and ultimately violence. Section 5. The End of an Era. Following the event, Alan Pissarro was arrested and charged with the murder of Meredith Hunter. He stood trial but was ultimately acquitted. The jury deliberated for 12.5 hours, and the absolute defining piece of evidence was that documentary footage. Upon viewing the film showing Hunter drawing his weapon and pointing it toward the stage, the jury acquitted Pissarro on the legal grounds of self-defense. It is just an incredible historical irony that the very documentary the Rolling Stones commissioned to make money ended up being the exact key evidence used to acquit a man of murder on film. Decades later, in a 1995 interview, Mick Jagger reflected on the tragedy, asking, "How could it all have been so silly and wrong?" Jagger admitted to feeling a really awful sense of responsibility for the event. However, he explicitly rejected the grand journalistic narrative that the press kind of placed on the concert. He didn't view it as the cathartic end of an era or some grand loss of innocence. For him, the burden was simply the profound disconnect between the media's grand mythology and the awful, grim reality that a young man had lost his life. When all the dust finally settled, the human cost was undeniable. We're talking 4 total deaths that day, Meredith Hunter's homicide plus 3 accidental deaths. Dozens and dozens more were severely injured. In the immediate aftermath, Alameda County officials barred future concerts from being held at the Altamont Raceway. Interestingly, the case actually wasn't officially closed until May of 2005, when the sheriff's office concluded a renewed investigation that definitively dismissed rumors that a second, unidentified Hells Angel had taken part in the stabbing. Which brings us right back to a final question I want to leave you with today. When we look at the raw data, the facts, and the actual logistics, is Altamont truly a grand mythical symbol of a failed generation, or was it simply the grim, tragic, and honestly entirely avoidable result of 36 hours of terrible, hubristic planning? I highly encourage you to dig into the sources and decide for yourself. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.